Okay. I'm guessing everyone can hear me because I was just shouting at you anyway, so the microphone makes it a little easier on me. You're in the room with footprints of the year's top attack vectors. If you're looking for something else, there's one kind of behind you, and then there's one over this way, I think. One has a cheeseburger. I'm not really sure about the other one. If I can make my terrible mouse pad work, we'll get rolling. So about me, while you're listening to me, I work at a company called Secure State, which you might notice from the top of my pretty slide that I didn't have to make because our graphic designer was like, follow the brand, Kerstyn, come on, just make it look nice. I was like, okay. And I am the lead consultant for our incident response, investigations, forensics, things like that. But we're a consulting company and we do just about everything else related to information security, which is why I mentioned that I work with pen testers, I work with auditors, I work with all sorts of people, which will tie into this talk. Also the occasional dog. I don't have a dog because I travel too much, so I get really excited that we're dog friendly. So that's cool. And then I always like to know something stupid and useless about my speakers to feel like I really, really know them. And my favorite holiday is Halloween, so I'm really excited that it's October. Everything's like turning orange out there. We have skulls. This is fabulous. You can bedazzle yours. I did. And so the key points about this talk, some of you might already know that the top attack vectors we see every year that really work to get you into a client's network or your vulnerable network or wherever you're breaking in that I don't want to know about whether you're supposed to be or not, they're not really that exciting. We already heard a little bit if you're at the keynote, we're still seeing MSO8, like when we go out, we're still seeing XP boxes sitting on the internet, things like that. So they're not sexy. I'm sorry. It's not going to be that attractive in terms of the attack vectors. But what I do when I come in after an incident or even when I'm trying to help a company build up their incident response program, their security program, is we can look at why those work, even if they're very basic, and we can see why did this work, and hopefully they'll listen to us when we say use this to strengthen your defenses beforehand so you don't have to pay a lot of money to call me in. I don't have to get on a plane at 3 in the morning and like take a red eye somewhere and then go to work. It's really great. Everybody's happy we're being proactive. I can help you build a plan instead of rushing out last minute. But like I said, it's only useful if you break those down into defensive opportunities. You don't want to just hand your client, or I don't want to just hand my client a list of, we messed up all your stuff. I want to help them get better. That's why I like what I do, and I get a lot of help from my pen test team that loves breaking into things. And then system artifacts are really great. But one thing I've noticed is that we're moving towards really needing network level intelligence, network level artifacts as well combined. So as I go through the talk, I'm going to do my best to talk both about what it looks like on your system when one of these attack vectors are used and what it looks like on your network. Because just going on system artifacts isn't really working. If you're in forensics, you probably know more and more that like dead drive analysis isn't really all you need. You need to be looking at memory. There have been plenty of cases I worked where if I didn't have a memory image, I would have never figured out what was going on. So I'm going to try to give you a pretty real-world 360 view of what these attack vectors look like. Basically, I wrote the talk that I wanted to see, because I would always go see this breakdown of how we broke into stuff, and then I'd be like, but what does it look like? Like, what do I see if I look at it later? And they're like, I don't know, I just break stuff. I'm like, that's awesome, but I bug the crap out of my pen testers basically to help me demo this and see what they look like so I can show you. As I said, working in incident response, have kind of a unique perspective. I come in after the fact, after everybody's freaking out. My first job is always to kind of grab people by the shoulders and be like, it's okay. I need you to eat because you haven't eaten all day. I need you to go take a nap because you've been up for 3 days. I know you're freaking out. Indicators of compromise typically focus on post-intrusion, what a file looks like that got dropped on your system, things like that. But moving that action earlier can usually help to minimize or maybe completely prevent some of these breaches that I go investigate. It's really frustrating when I go in and I'm like, if you would have turned on this one thing, or you would have alerted on this really blatant 60-day brute force on your SSH port that you left on the internet, anytime over those 2 months, like you would have never had this and you wouldn't have had to call me in. So while I love my job, I want people to kind of move forward. And I'm sorry if I'm talking too fast. I get yelled at. Somebody told me once that if you slowed down my speech pattern, by the time you got down to a normal person's speed, I would sound like Barry White and have a very deep voice. So I have a lot of data, though. So when we get into an investigation, we pretty much use whatever's there, use whatever's lying around. Yeah, you're in for terrible puns, too. I'm sorry. I should have put that in the description. But we'll use whatever's there. We've been into companies where they have terabytes of log data, but we've also been to companies where they're like, we have a firewall somewhere. So then I'm like reconning their network to find out where these live and find out where the logs are. So we're not picky about what we use. And that means that I've tried to also show a lot of different places to find this information. We've also found in our investigations, and the Verizon data breach yearly report always has cool information. They also always say there's almost always information in log data, but nobody saw it. So this is working to move up your detection instead of being like 8 months later when the FBI told you got breached and we found your log data from then, if you have it, seeing it as it happens and being able to react more quickly. Yeah, we're not picky. We're like that hyena. Something that we also find, this internal survey at the top that I'm talking about is something we did of our clients that were willing to talk about this with us. And we basically found that 3/5 of their money goes to blinky lights. And if you talk to like the management, they're like, I really want more people, but what I have budget for is stuff. So then it gets put on a shelf. There's been an Osterman report, all sorts of research showing that most of the stuff doesn't even get used entirely. It gets put on a shelf, or potentially worse yet, it doesn't get configured and it just gets stuck on your network. So part of the reason that looking at these indicators, actually using your tools, all of those things can be very important is that if you have that situation where you don't have enough staff, you know it. If you work at a SOC, you probably know, like, are you doing 18 things at once all the time? When I go in, I'm trying to talk to somebody about their huge important breach that their CEO is freaking out about, but they're also resetting passwords and stuff. Because most of the companies that I've been in at, they just don't have enough people. So if you can actually use all of the stuff that they're letting you buy, hopefully we can take some work off of the people, get more proactive, react faster. There's a little bit of a theme. Anyway. So the top attack vectors. Like I said, I bugged my pen testers, and every year they already compile all the stats of their pen tests, and they mark basically the very initial attack vector that got them into a client system. So obviously, I found out that I did not, in fact, make up the analogy of rock climbing and pen testing. I totally thought I did. Somebody told me I didn't. But if you think about that, if you've ever been rock climbing, I personally think kind of like the dirtbag rock climber and the hacker things go together. I just got into rock climbing, so I'm still in the excited phase. Like, I haven't gotten sick of it yet. But if you think about when you're climbing up something, you're going sideways, you might go down and around. You probably know that that's how a pen test is. But what we're focusing on is that initial attack vector. So anyway, they compiled the report. I mooched off of their research. I bugged them to help me see what these look like. So as I said, this very first one is usually mundane. I think that's where it's interesting. You can usually see these because they are fairly obvious. There are ways to see them and to detect those. I wrote myself like 4 paragraphs for some weird reason on this portion of the notes so that I could not see all of them. I'm really unashamed about like my awkwardness in presenting, so you'll get narrations on this whole thing. But these these are all the top 5, but they're not in any particular order. And I start with weak credentials. Yeah, I told you, like really bad jokes. Cute cats. Yeah, it's great. This applies to everything from like a baked-in system account, something default, an admin login that didn't get disabled, all the way to users on VPNs, on email, things like that are using weak or default credentials, sometimes described as like easily guessable credentials, anything that can be broken pretty quickly. These are generally susceptible to brute force or reverse brute force attacks, which I'll talk about later. As I said, a lot of common issues are not changing those default creds. It's really great though, right? You go on site and you spend 10 seconds Googling and then you're onto their system because they didn't change it. Also just not enforcing strong password policies or enforcing strong password policies. So, you know, spring 2014 works. Second one is system misconfiguration. This is a pretty broad group, but most frequently it's something like what we've seen, which is that we go to a client and we're talking to them and they're like, oh crap, we need another server. Open the closet, get out a box, put it on the network. And I'm like, was that pre-configured to a baseline? They're like, no, it's fine, it's good. And I'm like, okay, I'm just here to talk about incident response, but all right, bud. But also something else we've seen is firewall rule problems. If somebody comes in and they've inherited the same set of firewall rules down and down and down, and they don't understand them, so they just keep adding more stuff, and then they don't even realize that things have been misconfigured. So anything that falls into that group. A third one, this is new for this year. It's Netbio Spoofing. So this is a big initial attack vector for our internal pen tests, and then it's also what we call a linkage vector for externals. So once we get into the internal network, using Netbio Spoofing to generally pull credentials for a lot of users and then just go sit and try all those and see if we can get an admin or a domain admin. It's really great. I keep saying we because I tend to get to tag along as the incident responder. So I say we, and it's like my cool pen testers, but I'll happily claim to be part of that. I won't spend too much time in the nitty-gritty, but basically there are a couple of main flavors of attacks. We use whichever one we have to. This even can start to leach into topics like ARP spoofing, but if you just think about anything related to being on the network and then attempting to collect information about the users that are already on there, get their hashes, hopefully it's combined with weak credentials and we can crack their hashes really quickly. Fourth, missing patches is what it's labeled in the pen test report. I'm going to talk about software vulnerabilities in general with the assumption that they're unpatched if we're able to exploit them or somebody else is. This is kind of just defined as anything that's assigned a CVE listing, any vulnerability in a piece of software. I joked about MSO8 earlier. See a lot of these on Windows. They do tend to kind of move around the environment. 2014 was a really big year for all those things like shell shock and like sandworm and stuff like that. Flash has been getting dogged on. Internet Explorer perpetually gets dogged on. So any of those kind of software service vulnerabilities that should be patched and just don't get patched for whatever amount of time for whatever reason. And then social engineering. This one's a little bit harder to talk about detecting and alerting on and things like that, but it was one of our top 5 attack vectors, and it's very rapidly growing. If any of you had the opportunity, I was mentioning that I do lots of different things, and I've gotten to do a little bit of social engineering, a little bit of physical pen testing. It's very fun and it's very effective. So it's been something that we've been trying to test on more and more, and to start looking at how can we prevent this, how can we detect it if possible. And it's often used to deliver payloads similar to the other ones. It might deliver a piece of software that steals some credentials. It might deliver a piece of software that exploits a vulnerability. It's really remarkable how many people you can call and say, hey, hi, I'm the new intern at IT. Could you do me a really big favor? I'm supposed to make sure that everybody has gotten their new credentials for the intranet, and it looks like you're not on our list of having logged in yet. Could you please just go to this website for me? I'd really appreciate it. I'm supposed to get this done by the end of the day. And then they log in with their credentials to a made-up website that I give them over the phone. So we'll talk about that, sorry. These can be hard to detect because they're not necessarily initially going to affect anything, but we can kind of look for what happens after somebody has stolen legitimate credentials. So as I'm talking about detection strategies, I like using this and then looking at the audience, because this joke goes on in the show. And the people that know it will kind of crack up, and then the people that don't are like, why is she showing Animaniacs clips? Like, what? So as I said, we're going to talk about system level detection. You'll never guess I'm talking about analyzing the system. Finding what artifacts have changed, maybe in the operating system, something that a system log has generated. A big consideration here, and something that we run into trouble with, is so many clients will say, we don't have room to store all those. I'm like, okay, but when somebody notifies you 11 months later that you've been breached, I have nothing to help you with. So there's a lot of balance in verbosity of those, retention time. Obviously, I want as much as I can get, as long as you're not literally giving me 32 terabytes of information, because that's a little bit hard to go through. But we're looking for things like errors. We're looking for privileged account usage. Windows logs, I get really probably weirdly excited about, because they log a lot of information and it's usually on by default. So I don't have to trust the client or whoever's been breached to have thought about it ahead of time. It might just be there. Also, if we have some kind of host intrusion, detection, prevention, anything like that, antivirus logs, firewall logs, like I said, we're not picky. We'll use what's there. And so those can be very helpful. It's worth mentioning SEM systems or SEAM systems, or however you say this ridiculous acronym that nobody can agree on. And we've seen some of these used really well, and some of them that they just kind of become a log aggregator. So instead of worrying about we don't have the space to store these on the system, they say we ship them off to the SIM, and then there's just terabytes of storage on a server. But at least they're there, so I can pull them. Small caveat, I'll give you a tip right now before we even get into the bulk of this. Please, if you're having a vendor manage them, know how to get your logs back. I've worked cases where they go, we have an MSSP and we don't know where our logs are, so I spend 3 days trying to get permissions to see the logs of the person that I'm trying to help. But it's still very useful. They can be used for correlation. Ideally, if you're really like next level on your SIM, you're using rules to just pop up, hey, this looks weird. Hey, this looks bad. Look into this further. We'll also talk about network detection. This is everything all the way from having a really fancy IDS system down to your router. I have looked at routers if there's nothing else there. I've looked at, really simple firewalls that are super confusing, and anything that passes traffic, anything that sniffs, anything that I might have some network insight into is great. Even if this starts after the fact. I've gone onto sites and I've said, just hurry up and make me a PCAP. And then sometimes they're like, what the hell are you talking about? And I'm like, I'll walk you through it. We'll do this because it might still be active and you might be able to catch something. So this can even be infrastructure. It doesn't have to be a specific appliance, whatever's there. And then I think I've mentioned a little bit talking about signatures and behaviors in case you want some distinction on that. A signature is usually what we talk about when we talk about like antivirus, especially older school antivirus. You just download your signature, update. It says this file matches the signature, whereas a behavior is a little more general. This is a little bit harder for me to teach people because I'm like, you just gotta know. You gotta like walk up and be like, that looks fishy. I don't know how I do it. I really don't know how my coworkers who have been in the industry for 20 years do it, because I'll be like, I found nothing for 2 days of investigation. And my coworker walks up and he's like, that's bad. I'm like, thanks. We're all learning. I'm learning too. There'll actually be a point later where I'm straight up just asking for some feedback on any indicators that you've seen. So what do they actually look like with all of our detection methods? For each of these, we know that they're very, very broad groups. So like weak credentials, as I said, can mean all sorts of things. So what I did is basically picked a representative sample for each one. So I'll walk you through kind of my example. I've given an iteration of this talk once before. I added a lot more detail for GrrCON because I figured you guys could handle it, but I still get more requests for more detail. I only have an hour. Like I said, I talk really fast, and like I get myself out of breath, so that's always a really wise decision when you're standing up in front of people. But there's always room for more detail, and I'm happy to talk about it. So I'll use my one example, and then please absolutely feel free to add to the discussion. There's so much more that can be researched that could be put in here, and I'd appreciate it. But you'll get one. Everybody gets one today. No Spider-Man Family Guy laughs, okay. So for weak credentials, what you might see prior to a system account being exploited, my examples for this are a regular reverse brute forcing attack. Regular brute force is trying basically one username. You see, you got an email from somebody, you know their username, you're just going to slam a bunch of passwords against it. You're going to try, we always start with the season and then the year, because then, you know, if you capitalize the beginning, you got a number, it counts, right? It's a strong password. And you're trying a lot of those. The thing that you used to run into is then you get locked out, so you dial it back enough that you don't blatantly lock the person out of the account and just keep hitting at it. Reverse, instead, is that I have generated a list of usernames, and I'm going to try Autumn 15 against all those usernames, because now I'm getting around your brute force detection. I'm not going to lock everybody out. You might also see some default credentials tested across the environment, so like default admin credentials, administrator, things like that. And then another event that is more post-exploit is sometimes user creation, but this is noisy, so we don't want to do this on testing, so we don't want to be obnoxious and tip everybody off. Or also logins from strange IP addresses. So if I've gotten your VPN creds, I've broken those, and then I log in, but I'm in like, well, I'm based in Cleveland. I don't know why I'd be anywhere adventurous. But theoretically, if I'm in New Zealand and I'm logging in, then theoretically that's a post-exploit identifier. Unless they work in New Zealand. The point is you're looking for something unusual that user wouldn't necessarily be there. So on the system level, we're seeing a large number of unsuccessful logins. That's what I was talking about, that brute forcing activity. This can be focused on a single account or spread across many potential usernames. That's what I was talking about with the reverse. And I say potential because the number one thing to do is find out the username schema. If that's, you know, jdoe at company, then I'm going to build jdoe, I'm going to build jsmith, I'm going to build adoe through zdoe and all those things, and throw those in with a couple of easy passwords. And then possibly, really bad news, you see a successful one from that same origin location, that same IP or whatever, same group, because that means they tried a bunch and then they got into that account. So that's bad. Everybody kind of sees scanning and brute forcing attempt activity as part of being on the internet. What you don't want to see is a really long list and then a successful one. And then as I mentioned briefly, the topic of using default credentials. This might be, maybe you're seeing activity coming from the same source IP, or like I said, a same block, something like that, hitting a lot of different systems. And if you're available, or if you're able to look in and see, oh, I'm trying admin on all these systems, Cisco, something like that. These generally scan a lot of traffic. This is, again, what I was talking about, one of those being on the internet. You're going to see a ton of stuff because they're looking for low-hanging fruit. They don't care if they're noisy. We care when we're doing pen tests because we want to get in and not get caught, but some random person that rented a botnet doesn't really worry about that. So what we're seeing here, so we're still looking at system logs. This is an example of an attempted brute force on the user essay. Someday I'll be an adult and like buy a pointer, but for right now, my finger works. And you're just seeing that stream of login failed for user essay. And if you look, the entire log, if you can see it, sorry, only spans about 5 seconds. So you can do things like set up a time-based alert and say, if I get 10 attempts to log in on SA in 5 seconds, ping me. Now you have to dial this back for your environment. Like I said, if you're a bigger company, you might see this all the time. If you're a smaller one, though, that's something really easy to be like, who's sitting there trying to break into SA? If it goes on for 60 days, maybe be concerned. That's an example that just sticks in my head because we were like, what is wrong with you? But we helped them, so it's good. Of course, the trick is if you have people that fat finger their password a lot, maybe dial it back for them. And then one of the best places to see this is just those Windows logs. That's why I was telling you I get really excited. Security or application event logs can have this. And then what's neat, I think, every different type of logon gets a different ID. And so those can be used to kind of refine things. So maybe if you do have that person that fat fingers their password a lot, they're going to have a logon code that says basically, I'm sitting at my keyboard logging in. That's the logon type. And so if they mess that up 4 times, then you're like, well, it's somebody sitting at their keyboard messing it up. Whereas if they mess it up 4 times and it's a remote logon attempt, that might be different. So ways to refine your alerts so that they help you. Those are some ideas. And then this is actually an example of the reverse brute force, which you can see if you look at could not find a login matching the name provided. That can be indicative of I generated a name list and I'm just trying to get into things. On the network level, a lot of these tools, as I said, they're really noisy and they're atomic. So I'm making a really quick connection, I'm trying something, I'm closing it, I'm starting a new one. This is also a way to do a whole lot at once, and you're also not creating any long-running sessions. But that means that if you're seeing a lot of short nearly identical connections in a short time, that could be a pretty big indicator of somebody just trying to do a brute force attempt. They basically look like port scans, and you're just trying a password combination and moving on. One thing you can add into this as well is if you're seeing that and you're not sure what's going on, you can bring in some threat intelligence if you're up to that. Compare those IPs to databases, feeds, whatever you have that's available. Throw it into whois, find out what's going on with that. And often look at the protocol if it's RDP. That's usually kind of obvious. Wireshark screen captures are probably the worst thing to try to show on a screen, so I apologize to you in the back. But what you're seeing here is a PCAP that was filtered for SYN flags and involving a particular IP. So this is actually literally just a Qualys scan, and you can see a really quick repetition of SYN flags back and forth. So what that's doing is I'm saying, I connected, okay, you're connected. Okay, I'm connected again, okay, you're connected. Okay, I'm connecting it, okay, you're connected. You're just going back and forth and seeing those over a very short chunk of time of all of those, like I said, atomic connections, just starting and then dropping, starting and then dropping. They don't care, they're just gonna make a bunch of noise to try to everything and see if it works. So some ideas, I threw this in just to summarize, and also I don't think that I've given my slides to anybody to share, but these are public information, so I kind of added this in. I really hate when I go to a con and I get the slides afterward and I'm like, all of the useful information was in their notes and I got nothing. Cool, so I threw these in to try to summarize what I was talking about. And I can check and make sure I covered it and I didn't forget it in my rapid talking. So alerting on multiple failed logins in a short time frame, multiple failed logins from the same IP or block in a short time frame, and lots of connections. Misconfiguration can be hard to find because it looks like normal traffic. So as I said, misconfiguration can be admin consoles left open in the internet. We see a lot of those. Things that are out on the internet and they didn't get locked up, so they still have default logins. So you're leaving something like JBoss or Jenkins out to the internet with default logon. It's fabulous. I can log in and make myself a new user with no problem. It takes 10 seconds. Also insecure settings. This is the story that I was telling you about. You just, yank a box out of the closet, put it on the internet. It's fine. It's cool. We generally try to recommend that we build some baselines, some security baselines, instead of just putting them on. I have one of those laptops that everybody's like, your keypad's terrible. Thanks, yeah, it's great. So pre-exploit detection, you're looking for a lot of reconnaissance. You're looking for scans for those consoles and those pages. One thing that attackers can do is basically get a list of, here's the default admin page link if it's a default setup for whatever admin console they're looking for, and it'll scan for those on your environment. They'll be like, if I go to your site and I plug these things in, can I get a page? Port scans for insecure services, those are both kind of pre-exploit, and then afterward it kind of varies based on what it is and the amount of exposure. One of the things that I'll focus on is that positive response to an admin page, but as I said, this is kind of common with a lot of them. If an inexperienced attacker or somebody who's like perhaps ending the amount of time, getting on the last day of their pen test, they're a little less worried about making noise. User creation or unusual access is a pretty common post-exploit activity for most of these. But they're trying to be stealthy. So we'll look at those positive responses to scanning for admin pages on your system. What you can look for in things like access logs, especially maybe on your web server, something that's got an open-facing page that might have an admin page, looking for access logs that status code 200 says I gave them this page. Now, that's kind of your web server's job, right? I understand that's everything that's going to be in here, but you don't want to see that on an admin console that's facing the internet. You want to see that on your web page that you want everybody to see, not on your management. It'll generally create a lot of noise, a lot of 404s trying maybe a list of admin consoles, and then they might hit one if it's out there. And so what you can do is basically look for large blocks of scanning noise. If you find a suspicious IP, use that as a filter, look to see what else it was doing on your system or on your network. And then, so like I said on the network, we're basically seeing the same thing. So what's really great, if you have a SIEM or if you have someone ready to correlate, or I'm going in as an investigator, I'm going to take those system logs, I'm going to take the network logs, and I'm going to be like, what's going on? Because I might see it on the system that something came up, and then I might see it on the network that they've been pinging and trying to scan. And then, like I said, whether or not this is significant kind of depends on your usual day. One thing I mentioned using the IP, but you can also, if they haven't spoofed the user agent, look for something like GrrBuster. You'll never guess what we used to make this test. We ran GrrBuster. Those are spoofable, but it's something. So if you're digging around, you're looking, compiling evidence on, do I think this is bad or not? That's an option. Again, like I said, we have another packet. It's filtered for 200. The response code meaning content served. Caveat, I have been to clients that have SSL on their sites, but they can't see their own traffic. That makes stuff like this an issue because you can't see your own traffic, you can't filter on these things, you can't see what's in that packet and what's going on. But if you see things like this, especially if it's for something that shouldn't be there, now mind you, you also have to look ahead and kind of think, what pages do I not want to see crop up? Maybe set up an automatic alert that says admin.php should never be served. If it gets served, please tell me, and send an alert. But yeah, so, because like I said, things like GrrBuster, they look for all those default configurations. They might find a directory that's not supposed to be on the internet. So let's see if I got all in this time. Making sure you can see SSL traffic if possible. I understand that, sometimes you really don't want to see it because then you're liable for credit card information or something like that. But if possible, if this is just a public website, making sure that you're using some kind of inline decryption if you can, so that you can scrutinize the network packets, see what's going on. Like I said, looking ahead to find out what your default admin pages and things like that are, and alert on either scans to load them, or if you get so much traffic that's not feasible, anything that also has a 200 code that has a, yeah, sure, here's the admin page, go ahead and log in. And then you can also look for the pattern of lots of 404s, 443s, and then a 200 to say, yes, I finally got one. Netbio spoofing. As I mentioned, this is the one in the list of 5 that's really, really common once I'm already on your internal network. It's generally the attack vector, the initial vector for our internal pen tests. This is somebody, so beforehand, if you have the ability, looking for a new system on, I said new device on the system, I meant new device on the network, new system on the network. I've been to clients that have that capability, I've been to some that don't, so it's up to you if you can, if you know where things should be living and where they shouldn't. If I walk up and I social engineer my way into the office and I just plug my Ethernet cable in your port and I'm on your system, if you have the ability, alerting on that is great, because the next thing I'm going to do is just see what traffic I can sniff. After the exploit, this is very similar to the misconfiguration getting a hold of an admin page, because it just kind of depends. This is another situation where if you're seeing unusual activity for the hijacked account, they're logging in from somewhere they shouldn't, something like that. Afterward, that's a bad sign. Could be accessing privileged shares or trying to. That's basically the attacker is trying to explore with whatever creds they got from this attack. This is what I was talking about as to basically, if you have any suggestions, I'd be happy to hear them. I was bouncing some ideas off coworkers when I was building this slide deck. And basically, by the function of the attack, I'm sitting on your network. I'm trying to get you to authenticate to me either with a WPAT attack of getting your web traffic or sending you a link that says, I'm a share, try to open me, give me your creds, collecting your hashes, trying to crack them. If you're using NTLM1, that's awesome. Great, thanks. Or you're using password1 with a capital P, cracking those. But it's across the network. I'm making you authenticate to me and then taking your stuff. And so we didn't really have a lot of great ideas for what would be on the system. I think that potentially you might find some evidence maybe on like a host intrusion system, a host-based sniffer. If for some reason you really just leave Wireshark running on your PC all the time, that's cool. But it's still kind of networky. So if you have any suggestions, like I said, I'm here. I would love to talk about this because as much as I like this little jokey, this is from a video and it's like a mock British documentary. And they're like, what all buzz? We just don't know. I'd like actual data to put in here. I'm glad somebody liked that accent. Thanks. Some people have. The issue is that if we recommend that, I've been trying to come up with alternative recommendations. The biggest answer we get when we say just turn it off is it'll break stuff. So then you have to, hopefully your client wants to really fix that and you can work together and you can find out if we turn it off here, does this important application work? Does the system work? Things like that. But it is then we're entering into a potentially month testing and seeing what works. And depending on your client, some people just want it fixed and not broken, and some people will take that time. So I've been working on trying to find some alternatives to not just say, well, you have to turn it off, because then they won't. A big portion of them, it's kind of like if your doctor says, well, you have to just not walk for 6 weeks because you needed it to heal. You're like, I got stuff to do, bud. So it's an option, but it's kind of the nuclear option for a lot of companies. It's a good suggestion, though.
So in other words, a lot of times with these spoofing, I'm not just spoofing you, right? I'm
Mm-hmm.
everyone in the room. Could you do something like a thresholding alert and say, if I see an abnormal amount of connections to computers, and then I see audio from that computer alert?
That's a good suggestion. That'd be a good one. So sorry, what he was saying, since you probably all can't hear him, is couldn't you do basically a threshold? So if I'm sitting on the network, I'm not just spoofing that guy. I'm listening for every connection. I'm saying, yeah, I'm your web proxy. What's up? Hey, how's it going? So if you saw an abnormal amount of me connecting to every system, and then you saw me logging in to the user that's on every system, obviously that's a bad sign because I've pulled out those hashes. Now I'm trying to use them. And then prior to that was the question of, can't you just turn that off? And I was explaining that for a lot of our clients, they don't like that answer because it might break things. And then it's a lot of work on an already taxed IT team to try to test and find out what will or will not be broken if they turn that off. So on the network side, we do have some things to look for. And this is basically just a walkthrough of the attack. And you'll start with WPAD query. Hopefully I color-coded these well enough. I realize this wound up looking kind of like Dallas Cowboys colors. Probably not any fans. I don't know. It just looked like that. But so the silver is the victim, the blue is the attacker. And what you're seeing is my victim is going, hey, WPAD is an auto discovery for web proxy. And I'm saying, hey, I want to know who my proxy is. Can somebody please tell me? I want to get to the internet. I got cat photos to look at. And then the attacker, you'll notice that they're reaching out to 255. And the attacker is a different IP and it's going, yeah, I got you. I'm the web proxy. Cats, here, let's go. And so one thing that you can look for potentially, if you have the ability, is to set up a rule for if I'm broadcasting out to 255 and then 37 is like, hey, that's an issue. Or if we're retroactively looking at those logs, to me, that's an indicator of something funny. And then there's a response. Some data is exchanged and you see the request for that wpad.dat. And then you see an NTLM negotiation. That's what I was talking about trying to force an authentication to me so that I can say, yep, I got your hash, you're great, thanks, and go off and use your hash for evil. So some detection and learning ideas, what I do have thus far, in addition to, always turn it off or looking for threshold, there have been a couple of people that have written scripts to try to catch spoofers. And so the idea is I'm constantly asking for something that doesn't exist. And I'm like, hey, can somebody give me this file to help me get to the internet? And then if somebody else authenticates back, but it doesn't really exist, I know that they're making crap up because they're like, yeah, I got that. That's cool. And I'm like, all right, but no. So these do have to be set up beforehand, and they're not 100% accurate because these were written and then tools were changed to basically start inspecting those requests and see if they're correct. But it might be something, especially if somebody hasn't configured their tool, if they're just going to try to spoof every request they get, you might be able to catch them with a false request. And then prevention, something, as I said, I was bouncing some ideas off coworkers, something somebody came up with was the topic of protected ports. And so basically saying, I can talk to you, my switch, but I can't talk to him. Because if you're thinking about you're sitting in an office environment, what situation do I usually have to talk to my peers? They should never be, if somebody comes and sits down at a desk and plugs in, he probably shouldn't be talking to my system. I should be going through the switch or the router or whatever you have. And unless they're probably breaking protocol by doing peer-to-peer sharing, they really shouldn't be doing that. So that's an option. If you don't want to fully turn everything off, but you are okay with turning off connections between user systems, that's a pretty good one. And then you can also catch people doing like peer-to-peer sharing. So if you don't want them sucking up your bandwidth with that, that's also good. Software vulnerabilities or missing patches. Pre-exploit, we're looking again for a lot of recon. We're looking for what are you running? What version are you? When were you last updated? Things like that. Also a lot of staging of trying things out, setting up an exploit for that, seeing if it works. Post-exploit detection, you want persistence. So we see a lot of reverse shell usage. Excuse me, I've gotten on your system, and so now I'm going to make you always, when you boot up, call back to me. Or, again, user creation, exfiltration, any of those kind of things. Again, post-exploit, it always really depends on what the attacker wants. If we're doing a pen test, we're going to be fairly quiet. If somebody really just wants to get into your system and sit there, they'll set up some persistence, they'll set up callbacks. One of the things that I thought was pretty interesting, I was working a case, and I found a persistence mechanism that looked just like something our pen testers had been building. They'd been building an in-house tool to basically change something in the registry, change things in the memory, so your registry key loads up, runs up that process, calls back, never writes to disk. So I'm working a case and I see this and I walk over next door and I'm like, you guys want to explain to me why I just saw our internal tools same habit of calling back? And it's kind of what sparked this talk, because we realized that I could sit and check their tools for signs of this. Anyway, long-winded story about persistence, but that's something that pretty much once I'm on your system, I want to set up. So if you see somebody and they're exploiting a vulnerability, and then all of a sudden, every time you boot up that system, there's a new process running, or there was a registry key change, or things like that, bad call. Do what? It was not. I like stormed over dramatically. I was like, do you want to explain to me why it looks like I just saw our new internal tools prop up on somebody's system that's paying us a lot of money to do this? And it was great because it's the pen test team at the time. They're in this communal area and like all the lights are off. So I like storm in and I open the door and there's light and they're like, why do we let this woman have access to this room again? What? But it wasn't them. But it was very helpful because I asked, can you run your tool on this lab system so I can see what it does? And then it was helpful for my investigation. And then we realized all of a sudden we had this really great opportunity for me to kind of spy on what they were building and see the system artifacts change. And then this talk started percolating. So system detection, unfortunately, it's a vulnerability for a reason. You're basically exploiting an error condition. So that means that on the system level, you may not be logging this because your system just straight up doesn't know this is an issue. It's like, oh, this is fine. Privilege escalation, go for it, whatever. So detection can be focused on post-exploit artifacts. Like I said, user activity is a pretty common one. And so you can look on the system level. I've kind of highlighted the steps down to it, but you want to get to auditing your account management and just saying anytime there is a success or failure of making a new account, let me know. This is one of those things where I've also worked with huge companies and they're like, Kerstyn, if we alert on every single new account created, we're going to get overwhelmed. But you can kind of tune it to your system, your environment. I mean, if you're a smaller organization and the only people that should be making new accounts are IT, then maybe this is something you can work in your process where you say, hey, I just got an alert. Can you show me the change control paperwork that you just started a new user? Yeah, we just got somebody new in HR. Okay, great. Again, a size issue for some companies, but it's a thought. And then another example of an event log. Love event logs. Windows lets you get really granular. This is kind of similar to how I was talking about those logon types. They'll also have different codes for new user creation and group memberships assigned. Because if I'm making a new user account and I want to have persistence in your box or be able to look at things, I'm not just going to make an account. I'm going to make an account and then add myself to administrators so I can play in everything instead of just that little user box. Network detection is a lot more common due to what I was just talking about how the system doesn't really know this is an issue, so it won't necessarily log on it. So it's a lot more common to see these on a network level. There are also a lot more network appliances, and I know I was just dogging on like not buying a new Blinky box and just sticking it on your system, but there are a lot more options for network appliances that'll say, hey, I'll look for, I'll update once a week for new vulnerabilities that have come out, and I'll look for the signatures of those. I'll look for anybody on your system trying to run certain new vulnerability, things like that. You can see also connections to known bad IPs or IP blocks, things like that on your network level. Also, the possibility of then taking that and cross-referencing against, whatever feed you're seeing, whatever group you're a member of, looking for patterns, trends of who is trying to get in and exploit these. So what I was talking about an appliance potentially being able to look for a signature, this is an indication of exploiting the shell shock vulnerability. And if I can't even read my own slide. We have I think colon, semicolon, right, curly bracket, and then semicolon, I think is what I'm reading. This is really great. But what you're seeing there is a tiny piece of information that is closely linked to the exploit of shell shock. And so what we're looking at right now is just a packet capture manually, but there is sometimes the ability to say, hey, if you see this, somebody is trying to exploit this vulnerability on this box, let me know. Again, another thing where you can tune it up and down. You can say, if I see multiple attacks on, or attempts on a variety of systems in 5 minutes, let me know. If it's just one, maybe don't let me know, maybe do. Tuning your environment is a really big thing here. I can give you what it looks like, I can give you what I've seen, but getting in and digging in and knowing your environment is more working with, so we'll work with our clients with their internal IT, with their internal security, whoever they have, or if you work for an independent company instead of a consultantship, then consultantship. Anyway, working internally to find out what works for you so that you're not overwhelmed, but you're also never seeing these. So this is what I was talking about when I said you can potentially look for command and control servers also. The 172 address is a web server, and then we filtered it to find connections that were started by the web server, because this is typically fairly unusual activity. Your web server is going to say, hey, you started a connection with me, you asked for this web page, here it is. Web servers generally don't say, hey, how's it going? I'm a web server, have data. So what you're seeing is, the server is calling out to what was later identified as a command and control IP. Again, this is where if you have a threat intel feed, if you check out VirusTotal, if you check anything like that, looking for that information. And also, hopefully having a baseline of network activity, because we have seen web servers where we go in and we get excited and I'm like, I found it, you guys. I found your malware. I found out what's going on. And they're like, oh, that's the weekly call out to send, a summary of data. I'm like, all right, I'll go back to looking. So having a baseline of knowing if this is normal or if this is suspicious, maybe building alerts on that. If your web server starts calling out to something that it shouldn't, let me know. So again, I think I might have accidentally deleted my slide on this. I had another one where also there's a trick in Wireshark that not everybody knows. When you go to follow a TCP stream, there's a drop down, and you can actually show like one direction to the other or back, and it'll say web server to something else, thousands of bytes, and then that something else to my web server is 0. That's another bad indicator, but I think I got overzealous in trimming my slides. So making sure you can see SSL traffic again, because this is kind of useless if you can't see your own traffic. Threat intel, I feel like is kind of a buzzword. I'm afraid I might have to start taking shots, kind of like cyber at some places. But it's a useful thing. Staying up to date on new vulnerabilities, their exploits, what they look like, alerting on those indicators. Prevention, my favorite word is to say boxen instead of boxes, because it makes me picture tiny systems that have like big bull horns like ox. Couple of people laughed, thanks. And update your services. All those things that I feel like I tell all my clients, and I'm like, just update your stuff. When Windows comes out with an emergency patch, it's probably important. Please test it and then put it on as quickly as possible. Social engineering is kind of the big wash for detection, which is really unfortunate because I see this as a really effective and a really quickly growing method of attack. It's been more and more useful for us in just about any kind of testing that we do, anything from me trying to break into a building in person to all of our different pen tests, things like that. And if I could recommend to just about any company what they should be looking at, I would be like, of course, I'm an incident response. your monitoring and alerting, but then I would say your training, your education, your awareness. Because one of the biggest assets you have, if you're a 50,000 person company, is you have 50,000 brains. I used to, when I was a child in a classroom, computers are kind of new. I'm very young and everybody makes fun of me for it, but they were widely enough used that they were all in my school already. And there was a Garfield poster that I can't find, and I want one for my office that said the most useful computer is the one between your ears. So you have all of those. And those are really great things to work on, to educate, to help all of your users also be aware. Because I don't genuinely have any recommendations for what this looks like. This looks like me calling in. This looks like me walking up to a door with stuff in my hands and then somebody going, oh, hey, sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, ma'am. Go ahead through. It looks like sending links out, things like that. People are the vulnerability. This can be emails, this can be downloads, but one thing I will talk about is this can be used to straight up make a connection to start exfiltrating data. Like I said, that example of me calling up and saying, hey, just go to this website, please, thanks. People will fall for that. And then I also did kind of cover topics like gaining those credentials, what it looks like if somebody's misusing a legitimate account, things like that. So I will talk about kind of when all else fails, if I've social engineered you or I've used one of these other attack vectors to get access, the last thing that you can look for is detecting exfiltration. So data going out of your network where or when or in some amount that it shouldn't be. There are DLP solutions, data loss prevention. There's always a box that you can buy to do things, but it's commonly hard for somebody at a company to say, hey boss, I need another box. It's going to cost this much and it's going to do just this thing. So we will talk about a little bit. Oh man, I didn't delete my slide. I just put it in the wrong spot. That's exciting. I do have an example. So what I was talking about, you can filter the entire conversation, but you can also look at if my web server is talking out to something that's sending a lot of information and then nobody's giving anything back to me. This is another part where it also just becomes important to have baselines because you should know how much is always going out of your network on a normal day versus a huge surge going out on a system that normally only serves 2 gigs. If they start sending 50, maybe you wonder why there's so much more information going up. So yeah, that's really exciting. I didn't get rid of that. I thought that was a cool trick. I talked fast enough to get through all this, I think, so that's not too bad. That's pretty much all I've got. Like I said, I'm here all day. I'll be here part of tomorrow. I have a long drive, but I'm happy to talk about all this stuff. If you can't tell, I get really excited about dumb stuff like Windows logs. Please do take out my contact information because I forgot to stock up on business cards because I'm not a responsible adult, so I can't give them out to you like I normally would. So you can find my Twitter handle, you can find my email, find me walking around. Happy to talk about incident response, indicators, ways to break into stuff, way to catch people, all that good stuff. Thank you.